everybody, and welcome to tonight's UTZON lecture with Phil Bernstein. Before we do anything else tonight, I would like to just take a moment to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we're meeting tonight. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders here at this event tonight. My name is Claire Annesley, and I'm the Dean of UNSW Arts, Design and Architecture. And on behalf of our School of Built Environment within UNSW ADA, I'd like to thank you warmly for coming along and joining us here at the Powerhouse Museum. And I'd also like to express my thanks to the Powerhouse Museum for partnering with us on this amazing lecture, UTZON lecture tonight. So tonight we get to welcome Phil Bernstein to UNSW, to the Powerhouse, and to Sydney. The talk that we will hear tonight aligns with the interests of the ARC Centre for Next Gen Architectural Manufacturing, ArchManu, which is UNSW's flagship research group for artificial intelligence, machine learning, and digital transformation in architecture, design, and engineering sectors. Some of ArchManu's key chief investigators will be joining Phil later here on the stage for a panel discussion, so we can hear more about that. As Phil's talk will outline tonight, digital and computational knowledge are no longer niche skills, but a must-have to survive and thrive in the digital age. UNSW ADA is committed to teaching these skills to undergraduate students, not least in the computational design degree. We've been doing that since 2015, with hundreds of our graduates now transforming the architecture, design, and engineering profession with their skills and knowledge. And tonight we will all have the opportunity to advance our knowledge in this subject by listening to our very special guest. Phil Bernstein is an Associate Dean and Professor Adjunct at the Yale School of Architecture, where he's taught courses in professional practice since 1988. Phil has extensive experience at senior level in several US-based architectural firms and managed many complex commissions, including projects for Mayo Clinic, Washington National Airport, and Goldman Sachs. Phil is the author of several books, most recently Architecture Design Data, Practice Competency in the Area of Computation, and he writes and speaks extensively on topics of practice and technology. He has been honored twice by Design Intelligence as one of the 30 most admired educators in architecture, and we have the honor of hearing from him tonight. Phil, we're very honored to have you here with us this evening. Thank you for being in Sydney to present the UTZON lecture. If I could please welcome you onto the stage.
Okay, thank you, Claire. Appreciate it. And thanks to my colleagues from UNSW for this invitation. The remit I was given in this talk was to try to synthesize a number of things that I've been thinking about during the course of my career, the future of our profession as architects, the role of technology and how architecture may evolve, the relationship between design and construction. So I'm going to encourage you not to read the slides because you're not going to have time, and strap in because this is going to be a really fast, rapid rise. So at some level, this problem that we're going to talk about tonight began during the Renaissance when Alberti, when he wrote on architecture, essentially defined the profession of architecture by describing this idea that ideas or design and construction were two separate things. And what Alberti did in that construct was essentially, in an Enlightenment idea, separate the thinking about the making of an object and the process by which that object was made. And that's going to be a theme throughout the whole discussion tonight, but really in the larger context of how information and technology and ultimately machine learning, which I think is the topic that we all want to talk about, plays in this context. And this problem about information has been a challenge in the building industry for a considerable amount of time. There was an interesting text written about this question by a couple of researchers in the UK, and they said that the fundamental problem of the building industry in their analysis was the lack of detailed information about how design and construction proceeds. And I found this interesting because this particular text, which was written by Higgin and Jessup, was written in 1965. So it's 50 years ago, and we're already talking about this problem of the relationship between construction activity and design activity, and what the agency of architects should be in that context. And now that the relationships are somewhat liquefied by digital information, it raises a whole series of questions about how the profession is going to work. And I want to raise more questions tonight and explore this through a couple of different lenses. And the first one, which I think is almost existential in nature for us as architects, is this question of professionalism and what it means to be a professional architect. And the way I describe this to my students is, as architects, we play a whole series of different roles. We protect the public's health and safety. We act as agents for clients. We act as guides for builders in the construction process. We manage design teams. And in those four different kinds of responsibilities, there are all sorts of opportunities and there are also risks. And I tried to use this lens in my last book about that explored questions about machine learning and how algorithms and autonomous computation is going to affect questions of professionalism and how professionals are going to work. And the subtext of this, of course, is the duty of care, the standard of care, which is this abstract concept that says we expect professional people to have some kind of fundamental sense of competency. And when you're beginning to talk about the delegation of professional responsibility to algorithms, you have to start thinking about what it means in the context of the duty of care when you're working with an algorithm. And the two professors from Oxford wrote an interesting book in 2014 called The Future of the Professions, How Technology Will Transform the Work of Human Experts. And what these guys said was quite interesting. They said, we have this thing they call the grand bargain. And the grand bargain says we're going to create a class of professional people whom we are going to place our trust in. We're going to grant them autonomy over a wide range of activities. We're going to pay them a fair wage. That's the subject of a different lecture. And we're going to confer upon them independence, autonomy, and rights of self-determination. But what the Suskins also said was, when algorithms become autonomous, when machine learning becomes available to the professions, traditional ways of working will be streamlined, and that's what we were talking about this afternoon. But increasingly capable computational systems will transform the work of professionals, giving birth to new ways of sharing practical expertise. In the long run, this second future will prevail, and our professions will be dismantled incrementally. So here is the definition of the existential threat. Is it possible that the advent of these advanced algorithms is going to change the sort of fundamental nature of what we do as architects? And where might those opportunities and threats happen? And I think before you can have a conversation like this, you have to zoom out momentarily and look at the kinds of problems that we as architects should be thinking about. And I think there are a number of them. As architects, we're responsible for the public's health and safety. And if you read the Grenfell report, you can see that the failure there that ended up killing all of those people during that fire was a fundamental collapse of the systems of agency in the construction industry, a combination of supply chain failures, analytical failures, regulatory failures, and the whole relationship between the system kind of fell apart. At the same time, we're all very, very well aware of climate change, and as architects, we're going to have to begin to look at a different perspective on information and information flows. This is work by my faculty colleague, Alan Organsky, who studies the circular carbon economy, and his design process is influenced by an understanding of how carbon flows through this system, a system very much like the system that delivered the tectonics of the Grenfell Tower. This is some work that I've been doing with some colleagues from the University of Michigan. We've been teaching a series of courses and doing research on labor exploitation in the building supply chain. And we've been applying principles of life cycle assessment and life cycle assessment tools to look at embodied suffering in the building supply chain system. And again, this is an obligation that we have as architects to look at the systemic characteristics of things. And of course, there's work happening here in Australia around modern slavery, but it's just the very, very beginning. And I can tell you, I've been working on this problem for about 4 years. When you introduce this question to an audience of American architects, they look at you like you're crazy, like, what are you talking about? It's not even a topic of discussion in the second largest construction industry in the world. And then, of course, this is how I spent my summer of 2020, becoming an epidemiological expert, trying to figure out how to keep our School of Architecture, this is Rudolph Hall, which is our home on the Yale campus, open during the pandemic. And it was essentially an intersection of architecture and public health, where we studied the performance of the building as a system and made a case to the university administrators to let us keep the building open. So we, as designers, as architects, we have to start thinking in more coherent systems that have a relationship to one another. Now, those systems also operate in a completely different dimension, which is around delivery and supply chain, which is one of my other favorite hobby horses that I'm really interested in. And in that same book from Higgin and Guerin from 1965, they drew a series of very interesting historical diagrams that explicated the different kinds of relationships between the players in the project delivery structure. And what's interesting about these diagrams, although they're subtly different, is that these are diagrams from the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century about project delivery structures that are not fundamentally different than the way we deliver projects today. So we have a different set of problems, with different kinds of technologies, different obligations, different legal systems, different context. Yet the project delivery structures that we operate in that create the agency relationships between architects and the rest of the systems, the rest of the players in the system aren't really fundamentally different. And so I try to explain this problem to my students in a different way. I suggest to my students that the system, the building supply chain, the relationships between the players operate in a bunch of sort of tiers of money and regulation and clients who want projects and designers who design projects and constructors who build projects, and they form these temporary amoebas for every project that then somehow collect themselves and deliver that project. And we'll come back to this topic in a minute. But what's happened is, at least in the United States, the context, the economic and technical context, has created an environment where a whole series of different kinds of project delivery strategies have evolved in response to particular stimuli in the system. So in the 1970s, most projects in the US were built by conventional means, design, bid, build. Then we had a liability crisis, which brought us construction management. Then we had a worldwide downturn, which brought us design, build. The details aren't important. The point here is that the structures of our industry try to evolve responsively to the larger scale context. And now that context includes the ability of algorithms and computation to change the nature of the relationships themselves. And a subject of a whole other lecture would be mapping the evolution of project delivery diagrams with the evolution of the underlying digital technologies, which I think is a really interesting topic for another discussion. But in order to interrogate this question, you have to understand what the fundamental forces are between the players in the system. And in Western construction, the systems are very consistent. You have clients who aspire to have projects. You have designers who create this vague thing called design intent. And you have builders who execute that design intent. And what ends up happening is you have designers with all these weird obligations, like I come up with ideas. I deliver my ideas through these things called instruments of service. I have this thing called professional liability. I think about design, but I'm not responsible for building. And in many Western delivery models, there's no contractual relationship between the designers and the builders. The contracts are those gray lines there, creating this red Bermuda Triangle of ambiguity and risk that nobody wants to traverse. Meanwhile, our builder friends, they make things, right? That's what, in the States, even the contracts in the States, the work the architects do is called the design, but the work that the contractors do is called the work. So we don't actually do the work, we only do the design. They do the actual work. And they build, but they don't think about design. So you end up with these constructs that create an artificial division between the theory of what design is and how a project is formulated and how it's executed. And one of the most interesting examples of this is this very recently published paper by some folks at EPFL, including my friend Paulo Tombesi, about the design process that was necessary to execute the Sydney Opera House. And what Paulo and his colleagues argue in this very interesting but somewhat turgid paper is that the subcontractor who figured out how to build the shells of the building were as deeply involved in a design process as the architects. And that without that design process, that project isn't possible. And that design process had to do not only with tectonics, but with construction sequencing, with all kinds of problems of manufacturing, to put it in the context of the new research happening here, that made a very ambiguous relationship between what it meant to conceptualize a project and what it meant to execute a project. And in this particular case, the gap between intent and execution had to be narrowed or there's no project. And so the question then becomes, philosophically, what does that mean in a context where lots and lots of new technology is beginning to evolve? Because in this system of owners and architects and contractors, you have all this stuff flowing around. You have data flowing around and money and people trying to transfer their risk and materials and labor, and all those things flow around in these project delivery systems. And now what we're trying to do is support those systems with all kinds of new technologies, which becomes a very interesting challenge. Now, at the same time, the industry in which we work as architects has significant structural challenges that our colleagues on the build side are trying to solve. Lots and lots of stuff written about this. These two charts represent our friends from McKinsey, the consultants that are too expensive to actually use if you're an architect, but you can download their reports for free, so that's what I do, where they correlated digitization versus productivity. And they looked at all these different industries, mining and education and information technology. And these red dots represent construction. Negative productivity growth, low levels of digitization. Negative productivity growth, meaning we're getting worse rather than better. So I got very interested in this question and started reading about this. And interesting guys from the University of Chicago Department School of Economics wrote this crazy paper that you should read called The Strange and Awful Path of Productivity in the US Construction Sector, where they basically said, we are Nobel Prize winning economists, and we do not understand why the US construction industry is so screwed up. They said, you got all these, we're economists, we can understand this. We have all these inputs, labor, material, physical capital, intellectual capital. And in theory, you put all that stuff together, you make a building, and you create some kind of value add, right? You've made a thing that's more valuable than the inputs. The problem is, it's not more valuable than the inputs. The productivity, and I'm sure this is true around the world, but it's particularly true in the US, the productivity of the US construction industry, no matter how you look at it, even if you have a freaking Nobel Prize in economics, makes no sense. It has deteriorated from 1950 until 2019. This is productivity of workers. They looked at the price of construction relative to the price of the input, the material inputs. The blue lines are the material inputs. The red line is construction costs. So there's some kind of funky gap going on here, which is another challenge that we need to look at. And so they said, okay, we know these things are not the cause of these problems. We know there's no problem of capitalization. Salaries don't seem to make a difference. All this kind of economic stuff that I don't really understand. But what they did speculate on a long list of potential problems which they cannot scientifically prove. The two that I found interesting were lack of information integration, right? Think back to 1965, and systemic innovation friction. And this is something I hope when we were doing our workshop this afternoon, Andrew, I should have brought up. But there is a significant, there are significant structural inhibitors to large-scale innovation in the architecture profession and in the construction industry, significant inhibitors. And there was a very interesting paper written about this by the team from Stanford Sci-Fi recently, and they said, the building industry is in need of significant structural innovation, but there are 3 reasons why it is really, really hard. And they characterize these problems as what they called horizontal friction, which is the architects don't want to cooperate to improve their technologies because they're gonna give up their so-called competitive advantage. You know, Andrew, your Revit plugin is better than my Revit plugin, so you must be a better architect than I am. I'm not so sure about that, right? What they call vertical friction, which is in terms of the system, no one has the agency to inject an innovation. No one can actually say on a project-by-project basis, you need to innovate. The clients might be able to, but they're not interested. They're not going to tell you what Revit plugin to use or whether to use machine learning. They don't have the agency for that. And then ultimately what they call longitudinal friction, which is because the industry is so disaggregated on a project-by-project basis, it's very hard to make new things happen. So you have this inherent tension. There's the potential of all these new technologies. They're clearly contextual, systemic, and productivity demands for us to innovate and change and make new things happen. But the systems that we operate in are highly resistant to these questions, these questions. And in a way, Hank, you know, for some of the work that you guys are doing, you know, under the pillar of sort of business analysis, I would be looking at these questions, which is you can come up with as much cool software as your 21 PhDs can produce, but what happens to it? Because the tripled coefficient of friction here is so high. And I mean, it's obvious when you begin to unpack things. Don't try to read this. This is a diagram we use with our students to explain the flow of information between a contractor and an architect during an American construction project. I mean, I've worked on American construction projects, and I don't understand this, right? I do not understand this. There's so much stuff going back and forth all the time. So you say, okay, we've got these long-standing project delivery structures. We've got these productivity challenges. There are some big issues we need to work on. Let's apply some building technology and see what that might mean. So in my first book from a couple of years ago, I kind of tried to encapsulate the original BIM argument. The original BIM argument went something like this. If we use a modeling tool, we have a self-reinforcing flow of data between design, construction, and building operation that will make everything magically get better, right? That was the proposition, right? Here's what actually happened. We made more working drawings, right? This is what actually happened. The image on the left is a BIM model from some hospital project that Autodesk was looking at. And you look at that model and you go, man, that project is completely worked out. These guys have modeled the daylights out of this thing. This project must be perfect. That's not what people are doing. What people are doing is the image on the right. They're doing this exact same thing that we have done as architects since we started using technology, which is use it to draw things faster. And we've missed this data opportunity, at least in my view. But what's happening now, unlike, say, in 2002 when my team bought Revit Technologies and we started the Revit exercises, there's tons of technology out there now, lots and lots of things bubbling up, technological sources of all kinds of digital information. This is from my friend Jesse Devers, who's a venture capitalist. These are all the things that he watches, just in terms of potential disruptive technologies, and there's sort of tons of them, right? And so, sort of post-BIM, the Royal Institute of British Architects asked me to write this book, speculating about the relationship between the potential of machine learning and the practice of architecture. And my original thesis was we should resist our temptation to use these technologies to make more beautiful pictures, because that's what we want to do, or working drawings, And let's look at some of the process implications. Now, of course, my timing wasn't so great. This book came out in 2020, right? So my examples are all a little bit out of date, but my thesis was still the same, which was I tried to examine 3 characteristics of professional practice through the lens of autonomous algorithms. I looked at processes, I looked at project delivery relationships, and then I looked at business models and results. And we're going to take a speed tour through this. But first, I want to give you just a little bit of brief personal history. When I was an undergraduate student, architecture major, also interested in computer science, I took the introductory course for computer science majors. And then the next course was computer graphics, which turned out to be a class where we were going to spend multiple weeks drawing circles on that machine on the left, which is an oscilloscope, which struck me as super boring. So there was this guy there named Roger Schenck, who turned out, he was an assistant puppy professor at that time, but he turned out to be one of the forefathers of natural language processing. So I started taking classes with him. We wrote code on this thing. This is a PDP 1145 mini computer. One day, while we were all working on our homework assignment, it blew up in flames. It exploded in flames one afternoon. So in the process part of my book, I basically argue that our building industry technology has evolved in 5 distinct phases. 2,000 years of drawing by hand, followed by 20-ish years of drawing with computers instead of by hand, followed by some indeterminate period of building information modeling where we were modeling stuff in order to not have to draw it by hand. Then a period that I think we're in now, which I'm calling the data interstice, which is all kinds of stuff getting digitized like crazy. And then eventually we will get to an era of artificial intelligence. And I tried to argue that, I tried to create a series of classifications of different kinds of technologies, what I called algorithmic technologies, which are traditional software, empiricist technologies, which are machine learning, statistical machines that engorge themselves with data. And then what I call cognitive systems, which are systems that actually have some kind of intelligence about what they're doing, and I argue that we don't really have those things. And what I tried to say is we have the informational infrastructure right now, the things that are in the green box here, models and scanning and analysis software, construction management data, that can create a series of inputs. But the only way this technology makes any sense is for 2 things to happen. One is we have to find some place to put it that's a common data environment. And the other is we have to apply technologies to make sense out of it. And right now, there is no theory of making sense of any of this data. But if we can get to the point where that's the case, we can begin to do some of the things that machine learning and these technologies make possible, like automating design processes and evaluation of alternatives and automating construction on the construction site and buildings running themselves autonomously. And I try to apply principles of learning taxonomies to the capabilities of current technologies to argue that the vector that we're on with machine learning right now, which is essentially trying to train an algorithm with a ton of data so it can make educated guesses about the relationships, is wrong. And that in fact, these technologies need to progress from understanding through evaluation, through the simulation of environments, to eventually being able to create real important things. And that we're actually nowhere near any of that right now. And that as that begins to happen, these project delivery diagrams, like the ones I was showing you earlier, will evolve into new kinds of delivery strategies where design is dispersed across the whole project enterprise in a different kind of way. And then in the second part of the book, I looked at different ways that algorithms could potentially learn to do important things, starting by assessing context and eventually being able to generate new context. And then what the legal and policy considerations of that were. And one of the most important questions that I think that we have to deal with as professionals is, what does it mean to operate in a world where the software vendors take absolutely no responsibility whatsoever for anything that their software does? So I quote extensively from the end user license from Autodesk software, because I had some connections there where I could get what I needed, right? And the software license, I'm sure you've all read this, those of you who are Autodesk users, right? You all read this thing, right? It's 85 pages long, but paragraph 6.1 says, this software is not a substitute for the licensee's And by licensee in this context, it means you bought the license, not that you have an architecture license. You bought the license. It's not a substitute for the licensee's professional judgment or independent testing, and is not a substitute for independent design, analysis, simulation, estimation, testing, or other activities. In other words, use my software, it's all on you. You are entirely responsible for whatever kind of mess you make with this thing. And then we start looking at this question of whether these large language models can do things like pass the licensing exam. So there's a guy in the States named Brian Potter. He gave the text-based part of the American architecture licensing exam to ChatGPT-3. It did very, very well. Very well. Like within passing range or above passing in almost all of it. And so the question you say to yourself is, okay, does that mean ChatGPT should be a licensed architect? How about we're testing for the wrong things? How about the test is structured the wrong way? How about we're asking the wrong questions? That we ought to be actually asking different kinds of questions. And then finally, in the end of the book, I argue that we have to find ways of creating the infrastructure that can allow these technologies to evolve in an intelligent way so they're useful for us as an industry and as a profession. And I made that argument from a couple of different perspectives, but the one that I think is interesting in this context and in terms of the research that's happening here at UNSW is I argue that the industry itself needs a cooperative data trust. That in order to train these algorithms to do anything interesting, we need to collect a lot of data, and we don't have a lot of data right now. And it's one thing to train an algorithm with 1 billion sentences on the internet, but I could take every Revit model that God ever created in Australia, and it is not nearly enough data to train an algorithm, to train a machine learning algorithm to do anything. So we need to find ways to cooperate to kind of make these things come together. And then we have to carefully choose the things that we think are important to focus our attention on rather than letting the vendors decide what that is. And so I speculated a couple of different examples of this. Cost estimating is one that I think is very important. There's a company out there right now in the States that's experimenting with doing LiDAR scans of construction sites to calculate percentage of construction complete, which I think is interesting. And then my friends from Foster's office who gave me this picture. Here's a construction administrator from Norman's office. I think he's inspecting the job with a robotic dog, but I'm not exactly sure what he's doing out there. And I'm going to skip that in the interest of time. So let's talk about what this might look like in the context of architecture if we actually get to a point where machines are autonomous. And the way I looked at this is I tried to graph out what it would look like to go from where we are today, which is essentially using tools for documentation, to a moment in the future where these algorithms were autonomous and they were actually generating real, honest-to-God, complete building designs. And I tried to map that across the continuum of technological evolution. And I don't want to build a whole argument, but what I want to say is there is a progression of capabilities that these algorithms are going to have to get through before they get to the point where they're capable of doing the complex job of an architect. And as a consequence, I don't think we're in any kind of existential danger right now, but we may be in the future. And we'll talk about that a little bit because you can begin to see glimmers of things happening out there that might point the way. This is a little startup in the US called Upcodes that I follow. This thing takes a Revit model and does a building code analysis. Now, according to my license to practice architecture, mine's in California, that's my primary job. My primary job as a licensed architect is to protect the public's health and safety in a very narrowly defined realm of building code compliance. But here's an algorithm that can do it for me. And these guys are doing all kinds of interesting things. They've now created a second version of their system called Copilot that doesn't just do the analysis of the Revit model, it reads the building code and then analyzes the building from the text of the building code. So now I'm starting to get nervous that all that work I had to do to get my license is somewhat in danger. And then there are a whole series of other kinds of AI-based startups out there doing things like building and zoning planning analysis. This is one of my former students in Portland, Oregon, who's begun ingesting zoning codes from various American cities and then creating the analytical infrastructure to do site analysis. These are our friends from Hypar, my team from my former Revit team is now doing this startup called Hypar, where what they're doing is using artificial intelligence to memorialize design strategy. In other words, it's one step away from prompt engineering. They are memorializing the approach that a designer uses, so the approach can be tweaked. This is artificial intelligence plus scripting on steroids, right? And of course, this is the dream, right? The dream is, Hank, this is where you guys need to go. You need to be able to get to this. There's nobody on this job site. There's just a truck laying bricks like crazy from a model, right? This is the kind of, I use this video a lot when I was giving talks when I was at Autodesk as a kind of vision of the automated construction site of the future. And of course, we're nowhere near anything like this. But the question is, where does the information come from that drives a diagram like this? It has to come from the designers themselves. And how does that information transit through these systems to make that sort of thing possible, right? And so you're starting to see on the construction side little glimmers of these sorts of things happening. This is a startup in the US called Built Robotics. They bolt robots on the back of earth-moving equipment to automate essentially site formation. And the data that they use to do the site formation has to come from somewhere. And in theory, it should be coming from the designers. Of course, right now, because of what we know about the project delivery models, that's a very challenging proposition. This is a little startup called Creo that's doing something that I think is a huge opportunity in the building industry for AI, which is doing construction cost analysis. Construction cost analysis is a lot of super boring stuff mixed with some slightly terrifying speculation about the future, right? It's counting things and measuring things and then hoping that you've guessed how much they cost, right? So to me, cost estimating is something that has real possibilities. Building operation, same thing. Buildings are collecting tons and tons of data. This was an interesting paper that was written a couple of years ago that used building automation data as synthetic data sets to try to simulate how buildings operate. And if that becomes possible, that information becomes a feedback loop back into the design proposition itself. So you can begin to see that BIM diagram that I talked about that never came to fruition during that era of the technology, beginning to become possible in a different era of technology. But let's get down to the real question here, right? Can these algorithms actually design stuff? So here's a guy who has built an image generator where the prompt is essentially a sentence. And in this case, the sentence is, a modern curved wood and stone home in Kigali, Rwanda. And that looks like a house, right? That's a convincing image. That is not, however, a building. There are no plans, there are no sections, there is no elevation, there are no mechanical characteristics, there's no sense of spatialness. That's an image. There is a big difference between an image and a building. And I think our tendency as architects is to get super interested in images, and that becomes problematic. So I started experimenting with this. I thought, I'm gonna go to DALL-E and see if I can get it to do something. So I asked it for a detailed blueprint for how to build a library. And I got this. I did this back in November when I gave a talk at the University of Michigan. Complete nonsense. Looks like plans, except they're not. Looks like notes, except they're not. They're in Martian. I mean, if somebody can tell me what Bulbury-Guri means. And so I thought, maybe Stable Diffusion will do a better job at designing my library. Same prompt to Stable Diffusion. I got these cartoons of bookshelves. That's what Stable Diffusion thinks a library is, right? Now, what the Stable Diffusion is really good at is doing renderings. So this is a modern library with sun shining through the skylight. As an image provocation, super interesting. Not a building, not a resolved design, not something that represents a series of complex decisions and trade-offs and priorities and judgments, and something that someone can be held responsible for doing. And so ultimately, I think the argument here around these technologies has to do with what we deliver and what kinds of results we're going to be held responsible for. And I was reading recently about some of the work that Patrick Schumacher is doing in Zaha's office, where they have trained their AI on the thousands and thousands and thousands of models that they've generated as part of their design process. But in this very narrow band of aesthetic exploration, and forgive me, Patrick, for reducing parametricism to a narrow band of aesthetic exploration. They've managed to train an AI to make shapes as if they were shapes made by Zaha Hadid architects. That's a pretty tight range. And in my view, not just not interesting unless you're working for Zaha, but not the right avenue of investigation. That what we really need to be doing is applying these algorithms, and you're starting to see this in places that are more important, like sustainability, cost analysis, constructability, trying to bridge the gap in that red triangle that I drew. This is a startup that I advise called Planet Impact that does essentially on-the-fly, high-level conceptual sustainability analysis during project pre-planning using artificial intelligence. And the data streams that affect what we do as architects are very thick and very complex. I argued in my book that I drew this chart of the volatility of construction prices from 2011 to 2021. Now, given that that's the volatility of construction price inputs, how do you predict how much a building's going to cost to build? Which is the second question a client asks you after how low will you make your fee, right? The second question is how much is this thing going to cost? And we have all these data input streams. They're highly unpredictable, and we need to be using different kinds of technologies. But I also think there are even more profound questions that we can be addressing with technological strategies that can give us more insight about the relationship between all of the activities that occur in the delivery of a building, not just the design of the building. I built this diagram, don't try to read it, but I built this diagram for my students in my modern slavery course. And what we were trying to explore was the following question. The sketch on the upper left is Charles Gwathmey's sketch of the renovation and addition to Rudolph Hall at Yale. The image on the right is a Peruvian child in a zinc oxide mine. And what we were looking at was when Charlie decided to clad the addition to the building in zinc paneling, he enslaved children in Peru. He enslaved children in Peru. And there were 10 or 14 or 16 decision-making steps between that decision in conceptual design and that child in that mine in Peru. And there is no way right now for any architect to have any view through that problem to understand those kinds of implications. And my argument is these kinds of questions, whether sustainability or social justice or any of the larger contextual questions, are the ones that are the most important ones for us to apply these technologies for. And the way that we're going to do that, at least in my view, is by being really, really clear about what the strategy is for the evolving technologies that vendors may choose to develop. And we talked about this afternoon. I feel very strongly that the profession needs to be very clear about what it tells the providers what they should do. And in the conclusion of my book, I basically said, there are 5 things we should do as architects if we want to have some control over our destiny as these algorithms become more autonomous. We need to decide what we think the most important issues are, and I've made an argument for that. We need to start talking about design to include performance. What does the building actually do? Not just what is the object, but what does the object actually do? We have to create some kind of data infrastructure that makes this possible, and I argue that that was that data trust. We need to re-examine the relationship between design, construction, and asset operation. I think as long as we continue to believe as architects that we can solve this problem ourselves without collaborating with our partners, we're going to be spinning our wheels around this. And then ultimately the argument here, which I think is the most important, is the value of what we do as architects can be fundamentally changed if we deploy these technologies in an intelligent way. If we can use technology to actually improve the nature of the built environment, then we can break out of a lot of the economic and other constraints that we've been dealing with. And I think one strategy that, given the work that's happening here in the research project that we're talking about tonight, is looking at how those structures might work. Information flow in the building industry is not well understood. It's not clearly defined. One of the things that characterizes it is, as you move from phase to phase in a construction project, you have serious decline in the quality and fidelity of the information. Every time it gets handed off from one party to another, there's a fidelity drop, and that's sort of the first opportunity. And that in a study that I did a couple of years ago, talking to a lot of architects and contractors, what I realized was the world that we're in right now is one I called transactional incompatibility. Lots of data has nothing to do with one another, and therefore nobody can trust it. And so the real strategy, or in a way, Hank, the top line of your effort is to get to trustable data, right? Is to get to the point where people can actually trust the data that they're actually using across a realm of different kinds of strategies. And so my suggestion is that you look at three possibilities, that you explore different kinds of what I would call procedural initiatives. In other words, how project delivery models might change. That you look at different sorts of what I would call cultural initiatives, which is how does the industry behave and cooperate, and how do we work with one another? And ultimately, try to think about this problem as the technology is creating a kind of coherent thesis of how we might all work together. That, to me, that's the real opportunity. And just in case you might think that any of these are any kind of new ideas, this is a postcard I found from the late 19th century from France. Here's the architect in his robotic control mechanism using a robot to build a building. So if we can just do that, I think we'd actually be in pretty good shape. I think we'd be doing well. Okay, great. Thank you very much. I was only 57 seconds over.
Thank you. Then I would like to invite the panel as well. Thank you very much, Phil, for this very, very inspiring lecture. I think it touches really a lot of kind of topics that the ARC Center for Next Gen Artificial Manufacturing want to look as well. Before I'm going to go into question, I would like to ask the panel to quickly introduce themselves so the audience would know who we're dealing with. Mark, can I start with you, please?
Mark Burry, Professor of Urban Futures at Swinburne University of Technology and the lead in the Swinburne Sustainable Built Environment Initiative.
I'm Ivana Kuzmanovska. I'm the manager of the ARC Centre for Next Gen Architectural Manufacturing.
Jane Burry, Dean of Design and Architecture at Swinburne University.
And my name is Henk Häusler. I'm the director of the ARC Center for Next Gen Architectural Manufacturing and the director of Computational Design and deputy director of the AI Institute. Are there any questions from the audience? I have a lot, but I want to give the audience a chance as well. But maybe before the audience warms up to the question, one question is
What we call stunned silence.
Exactly. One question for myself, not really on machine learning and AI, but the question of innovation you raised. On the one hand, in the audience, you've got a profession that is completely occupied with innovation. Universities, we do research, that's our core business. On the other hand, you've got an architectural profession that is in the need of innovation. Where do you think are the barriers for enabling innovation in an architecture firm when it's quite possible to innovate through a university system, like in biochemistry, in science, to really link innovation in a university to an innovation in practice? But if there's an innovation problem in the AEC industry, where does it stem from?
So is this for me?
That's for you.
So many thoughts, right? So there are some structural problems, right? Which is, for example, your research grant that you just received, really extraordinary thing. Nothing like it in the US. The research around the building industry is desperately underinvested. I think I read recently that of all the research money that the US government gives out, and it's hundreds of millions of dollars a year, some tiny percentage, like 0.2%, goes toward the built environment. The built environment, which, by the way, we all live in and contributes 40% of the carbon, enslaves all these people, and no research money. So you have that problem. Then you have practices that are heavily constrained by low margins. And it's a well understood business principle that low margins are strong inhibitors to what you're characterizing as innovation. And then I'll add as a footnote that when you say to architects, you know, you're not innovative, they say, the hell, I'm not innovative. I'm a designer. That's what I do. I innovate. But around process or technology, it's very, very challenging. So I think that what is most likely to be the most interesting is for the universities to create individuals who will go into practices and what's the verb I'm looking for? Inspire, irritate, prod their practices to make changes. Because right now, the Western architecture profession is not structured in the way that, say, medicine is or other disciplines to really receive and translate research into action.
I think Mark could then answer that with the embedded model that we've got in the center, how we try to approach innovation in the practice through embedding PhD students into practice.
Yeah, but I'm still sort of smarting from an observation you made this afternoon, Phil, around.
Only one?
No, it's one particularly. This one is it's a goodie. It's all very well. We can innovate at a very high level within architectural practice, but where is the connection to the construction industry? And of course, you made a big point of the McKinsey and others, the drop in productivity. Two silos, quite difficult to breach between the two.
Well, I mean, I think this question goes to the kinds of innovations that the research grant and the center here are engaged in have to do with bridging that gap, bridging across that gap. And there's a certain amount of, I think, limited, interesting, and potentially sexy work that can happen amongst us architects. But it's to look at the problem that way is to ignore the basic structural characteristics of the system that we work in, which is 10 times as much money and 10 times as much risk is on the construction side rather than the design side. So it's like what did the old bank robbers say? Why do you rob banks? And they said, because that's where the money is, right? It's the same issue here. What are the vectors that are going to create real innovation? And I think that there has to be some discussion about how you overcome the structural friction to innovation. And if we just try to do that in our band, our little design band in my diagram, there's only so much we can do. But I'm sorry that I didn't mean to hurt your feelings by that observation.
No. That's what I mean, for us, it's second nature. That's many of us are. It's that connection between the ideation and the production of the artifact. That's our gig. But it doesn't stop the difficulty existing, which is the translation of.
Yeah, I mean, to me that was so interesting and kind of weird that Paulo's paper popped up just as I'm prepping for this lecture, right? And he's making this argument that UTZON had a vision for this project that was completely tectonically untranslatable. And then there was this whole Arupian exercise around geometry, but even that didn't solve the problem. And that there was it was necessary to impose a very disciplined, structured design process to make the project actually happen. And I mean, I'm not familiar with all the intimate history of the project, but clearly that dynamic had something to do with the tension that ultimately led to him walking away from the job. So I just thought it was super interesting.
The other interesting thing about that paper, and I saw them present that research in Denmark last year, is that they talk about the hidden columns. So in the design and the way that we sort of know this building and we learn about this building and we teach this building, it's this incredible feat of engineering where it's all these shells and they come from this same circular geometry. Nobody talks about the columns. There are columns in that building. And so this sort of divide between what we glorify as the design concept and then actually the execution of that. I mean, those columns are why that building stands, right?
Yeah, but I don't know. Excuse me. I thought Paulo was too obsessed with those columns, frankly. I mean, we talked about it and I was like, look, the building works on a lot of different levels. The original concept of the building was unconstructible. The fact that there's some hidden columns in there, I mean, does your mom care that there's hidden columns in there?
But exactly, that's the point. Yeah. It's like, why are we so obsessed with selling this pure architectural concept as if that's what makes the building good?
Well, yeah, but
right?
It offends us as architects that there are hidden columns. I'm not offended. I'm kind of okay with it.
I'm okay with it too. I think we should talk about them.
So another thing I think was hidden, in terms of that productivity of construction is the safety, because the safety has been almost sort of inverse. So while we're trying to represent modern slavery and somehow model that through this digital modelling, we've been throwing people at building sites. That's been our sort of answer to safety so far, is to put a lot more people out there. And in a funny sort of way, in architecture as well, computation has actually necessitated the throwing of people at practice. And so that's another measure of productivity. I don't know what you think about that, but it's definitely a sort of output divided by people hours involved in all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a kind of good news, bad news thing. It hurt me deeply when one of my students said that he didn't want to go work for firm X because they were going to turn him into a Revit monkey. So the term CAD monkey had become Revit monkey, which is, as somebody who drove that Revit strategy, kind of hurt my feelings a little bit. But it's true that we now have a whole other sort of subclass of knowledge workers who have to create the inputs. I mean, we talked about this, Andrew, this afternoon, that you have these, in Robert Stern's office, you come through the office through the model shop. You come out of school and you go work in the model shop. But in your office, you work in the content shop. You make Revit content for a few months. And if that hasn't completely destroyed your soul, you get promoted to the studio. Is that how it works? Yeah. But I will say that at least the statistics that I've looked at, the Revit adoption has driven a lot of productivity. That the global architecture profession is producing a lot more work with a lot less people now. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, subject of another discussion. But
I think there were questions from the audience.
I had a bit of a question. Is that sound working? Yep. Yeah, look, I'm a practicing architect and I love the idea of trying to sort of make the sort of world of design and building come together. There's no doubt about it, that would be an ideal situation, the improvisation of design thinking and building. But what I find, and I try to make a perfect world and try to document things properly and understand all the processes. However, what I find most difficult about building are the latent conditions. I mean, we talk about building as if it's a digital world, but in fact, most of the time I find myself digitising buildings and bringing them to site. It's the weather, it's the ground conditions, it's a whole lot of, I mean, I can't believe how many variables there are in a building project. So I can see absolutely why building is becoming far more inefficient, because we just keep loading in more and more variables, whether they be cultural, climate, all these sort of things. So it's becoming very, very, very complicated process, moving from an idea or a concept to a construct. And I don't see it in all the diagrams getting any simpler. I see it getting more and more and more complex. So how do we, and as a practicing architect, as you say, the margins are very, we're not sort of gifted with research grants to make our process more efficient. So we work in our very limited field under very difficult time constraints and economic constraints to come out the other end with something that approximates our image. And we work with our builders as, good builders and smart builders as best we can, but it's a very improvised, very dynamic process.
Well, I mean, there's no question that the building enterprise has become much more complex, right? And one of the things that's interesting about Paulo's paper, right, is that leap that UTZON took with that design concept was way beyond the ability of construction as it existed, in the late 50s and early 60s. But I think in the context of what I was talking about, it seems to me that we have the opportunity to use these technologies to begin to create environments where we can simulate what happens. So if there were an AI context, for example, that could say, okay, here's my project. I have simulated the construction sequence. I'm now going to apply a series of externalities, bad weather, commodities, problems, labor shortage, safety failure, and try to use the technology to anticipate and manage the complexity instead of making more complicated shapes that are prettier, that would, to me, be the right strategy. But we can't do that unless we work with our construction partners, because we need their help to figure that stuff out. You know, instead of thinking of design intent as I wish it were a better model that you could build from, right? A design intent is, this is what this thing is supposed to be. Now let's figure out how we're going to get there, and what tools should we apply to make that happen. And in a way, that's the subtext, I think, of this research center that these folks are setting up here, which I think is extremely interesting.
I think we've also been in a very fortunate situation. We've got now the ARC grant that gives us the background to understand the challenges of practice in the pre-design phase, the post-design phase, and the business phase. But we've also been awarded 4 weeks ago, another grant, a $6 million CRCP grant on 3D printing housing in remote environments. So remote Australia, in the Kimberleys, for example, or Northern Territories, using earth materials. Where we've got a very unique chance now to test certain software and thinking in the ARC center and apply them in a project on site and see if they work out. So there we've got a chance to see if the weather conditions, if the climate conditions really work, and if our thinking and our software explorations, and not only our software exploration, but others as well, could be done and translated into a practice of building housing. I think there was a second question over there and over here as well.
Hello. Yeah, I want to ask about BIM. BIM as a concept, as a framework of information, like it's been around 20 years after CAD. Now, recently I'm a practitioner. In the practice, there's a debate. Shall we keep sticking using BIM, or with the new ISO 19650 project information model, asset information model, to achieve the digital twin? There's an argument, so shall we have a better framework concept than BIM, or keep developing it?
Well, are you asking me that question as an
Yes.
ex-Autodesk employee? Because I'm not sure I can answer it, and if I did answer it, they would not like my answer. Right.
Because, sorry, you know, there is the Amazon solutions for digital twin, and there's other solutions where they're stepping away from BIM restrictions.
I guess. I mean, can you explain to me what a digital twin is? Because I have no idea what a digital twin is. Seriously, there are all these kind of funny terms of art floating around out there that are all about speculative technological capabilities that don't exist yet. And I think one way to think about this problem is, you're going to see, as I tried to show you in one of those diagrams that sped by, I think you're going to see about 10 years of extremely intensive digital innovation that will eventually resolve in what happens after BIM. But my own view is the data problem is so complex that there will be some dimension of artificial intelligence around that. But I don't think you need to go cancel your Revit subscription anytime in the foreseeable future. Not just because you need it, but the architecture profession adopts disruptive technology incredibly slowly. I mean, we bought, when we bought Revit Technologies, I led that team that did that because I was convinced in 2001 that the company's future couldn't be based on AutoCAD. And I was one of the many vice presidents who, stood up in front of the CEO and gave a presentation called "The Last Version of AutoCAD We'll Ever Need." It was 2003. I mean, what an idiot, right? And so when we really started working hard on Revit, we were thinking about it on tech company time. Like, we're going to get this thing out there, and in 3 years, we're going to get to mass adoption, and by 2008, we'll be on to the next thing. And I remember Carl Bass, who was the CEO at the time, while I was leading this group, it was 2008 or 2009, and he looked at me and said, "Okay, Phil, great job with this BIM thing. What's next?" It's 2008, right? So now it's 2023. It's been 21 years, got somewhat widespread adoption. People really hate the thing, which means you're successful, right? It's making a ton of money for the company, and we still don't know what's next. It's 21 years later, right? So the adoption curves, not just because architects are slow on the uptake, but you got to sequence your disruptive technology with your collaborators and your projects. It takes a long time to get to the next thing. And so I don't know what the next thing is, and I don't think anybody knows what it is yet. But when it comes, you're 10 years away from having to deal with it, if that makes you feel better.
Okay, one last question. I think there was one in the middle. Put your hands up, please, so you can see it. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I have a question more for the panel and the center of ARC, but sort of, I think, inspired by your talk, Phil. And I sort of have two questions rattling in my head around technology. And I think one is sort of, what do we use it for? And your work with AutoCAD and BIM, and I think talking around connecting builders and designers, there's a drive for efficiency and doing things quickly and maybe more efficiently. And I'm curious, I think, also to think about how do we do it, and do we do it well, and what are the ethics of it, which is what I'm seeing in your more recent research that's now connecting, in my mind, more similarly aligned with Peggy Demon's work and some of her teachings at Yale. So I think the question I'm trying to grapple around is, while we have the technology that we have now, how is the ARC Center with this new funding money going to kind of ask questions around what are the ethics of it, and how do we use the technology in the right way, essentially, especially as you, Hank, also mentioned, looking at building houses in the Kimberley, which is a really noble, I think, undertaking, like looking at housing in remote Australia, but it's also very fraught and complex kind of realm to be working in as architects and designers. And on the duty of care and responsibility, above all, as designers and architects, I think there's a higher level or higher calling of trying to undo maybe some past injustices and trying to right past wrongs. So I'm curious about what are the potentials of that, and also feel how you see maybe this change in your interests.
That is a very multi-layered question. So we choose to go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard. So we also do those kind of things not because they're easy, because they're hard. We know that it's a hard challenge what we want to do. So what do we want to achieve with the ARC Center? We've got 6 goals. One, architecture is using too much materials on Earth. We can't continue like that. We're producing too much waste. We can't continue like that. Our carbon emission is too high. Most projects, large projects, are delivered not on budget, not on time, and not for the benefit of the community. So these are the 6 things that interest us. Why we invest in technology is with 2 simple answers. Digital technology affords us scale and speed. So if we develop a script or a tool, we can send out that kind of tool to one person or to 1 million people at the same time around the whole kind of planet. It's similar like when you send an email. You write an email, and the time it costs you to write the email is the same if you send it to 1 person or to 6 billion people. Same amount of effort. So I think if we want to address those kind of 6 goals that I explained, scale and speed is very, very crucial. And that's what we try to do. The project in the Kimberleys is, again, it's not on the Kimberleys, it's remote and very remote Australia. I think there are specific problems there. Cultural problems, yes, but being a computational designer, I'm looking more onto the texting. I'm not an expert in cultural things. We've got expertise in these in the faculty, but looking into how we could address problems on housing, on affordability, on supply chain issues, on the 6 issues I've raised through these projects. And I also think that if we test them and prove them through a paper, it's potentially good for an academic circle, but I think for an architecture circle, it's good to show here are projects that we try to do certain things, and we verified ideas that we had through the constraints and the difficulties you mentioned before. Because otherwise, it stays in an academic circle where you can tweak certain kind of things, or you don't really discuss all things in the paper. I think a building that stands is in the ultimate test if our thinking works. So with that last note, and I can see Phil coming to the stage for some concluding talks.
Okay, good evening, everybody. I'm Philip Oldfield. I'm the head of school at UNSW Built Environment, and it just falls to me to close and sum up tonight's proceedings. So I'd like to start by thanking all our panelists, to Mark Burry, Ivana Kuzmanovska, Jane Burry, Hank Hausler, and in particular to Phil Bernstein for giving us the UTZON lecture tonight and for joining us all the way from Yale and delivering such, I think, an impactful and timely lecture which captures some of the opportunities and the challenges of our current era. Now, before we all go home and try and design our own libraries on DALL-E, I do have one more important announcement, and we'd be delighted if you could join us for drinks and canapes and networking in the entrance foyer area directly after we've finished in the next couple of minutes. And that's the area just inside where you came into the building. And I'm sure there's lots of opportunities there for if there's any outstanding questions we didn't manage to answer. If you've got any burning questions about Revit staircases or clash detection, that's your time. But we do hope there's
I'll
a really...
give you a phone number you can call.
There will be alcohol. But there is a real opportunity to have good networking and discussion with all our panelists. And I hope you've had a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining us.